Welcome to episode number 6 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Simon Agosta. Simon is the owner of Melbourne-based brand Milkbar. After suffering an injury, Simon found himself sewing garments from scratch on his mum's old sewing machine. The brand Milkbar is birthed out of his third-generation Italian perspective on the inner north suburbs of his hometown, Melbourne. Simon designs and creates with a meta-modern lens on culture, bringing things from the past into the present and recontextualizing them for the future. This episode is just filled with wisdom. Simon not only makes absolutely fantastic garments, I'm wearing one right now, not sponsored this by the way, just really highly rated the clothes, and I really thought I would resonate with Simon's story from reading his blogs on his website. So I got in touch, we had this conversation, and I was not wrong. The guy is just full of wisdom, and he's a really good example of how your personal myth can unfold, and it can bring fruitful things for you and for the world. Insights into yourself, and ultimately, bring forth some top class creativity. So I really hope you enjoy it. We've had a few new followers on the YouTube. People have been really lovely in the comments. Thank you for subscribing. If you've come to visit again, I hope you enjoy this episode. You can find us on Instagram as well, where we post some other content. And okay, so here we go. Episode 6, Simon Agosta. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell me, what does beauty in the mundane mean to you?
So, probably everyone has their own relationship to that if they have it at all. But something that I really focused on probably, midway through my teenage years was like, I can be very idealistic or romantic in some ways. I think a lot of people that are creative suffer from those things. If you want to consider it suffering, there's a lot of positives and negatives. And I kind of took it upon myself, instead of being too idealistic to where like the day to day is being, in contrast is kind of falling way below my ideal. I kind of made an effort to rethink some of my ideals and maybe appreciating or having gratitude for some of the simpler things in my routine. And that manifested into a lot of like the language or philosophy in the brand of Milkbar. I'm not sure what it's like where you're from, Chris, but in Australia, a lot of our culture is very much influenced by America or even the UK. It's also a culture of a lot of immigration. My family, my grandparents immigrated from Italy, and because there wasn't much of a culture in Australia to assimilate to, a lot of the cultures kind of um, stuck to themselves and stuck like within, Italians hung out with Italians and Greeks hung out with Greeks, and definitely as the generations have gone on, that's kind of people have come together more and it's a lot more multicultural. But because of that, I think people here have always looked abroad to America or the UK or even their own family traditions. And that's good in some ways because you get to hold on to tradition a little bit better. The thing that's strange though is we never really appreciate what's in front of us in our country. And I just think about it locally in like Melbourne. Now that's actually changed in the past 5 years slightly. I think people are like coming to embrace and be very proud of like what we have in our city, specifically in Melbourne. I'm not sure what it's like in other states and other cities, but that is kind of my relationship with beauty and the mundane because my first thought was like, of course, my whole life I've been told to romanticize New York or love a European summer. And, it's kind of a cliche in Melbourne. Everyone around this time of the year starts to talk about if they have plans to go away going into our winter to go into a European summer or something like that. And I I made it a really strong point in my own beliefs in life to kind of like start noticing what I appreciated about, I wake up, it's a Monday, I go here, I walk here, why not like that? I'm a big believer of, I'm in marketing, so why can't I market certain things to myself? You know, kind of romanticize intentionally things to myself. So I was kind of able to do that over a short period of time with the local culture here in Melbourne. And then that kind of translated into a lot of my work with my brand Milkbar, where I'm kind of, you know, kind of bringing up themes or design aspects or culturally significant things locally that people wouldn't even think twice about, and then I'm kind of like repackaging it and giving it back to them, and then like, oh, this is amazing, and it's like, well, you walk past this every day and you never think about it. It makes me think of you know a story about the way Ralph Lauren started. He was like basically really just when you think about what he did over the years is like he kind of took a lot of very European culture uh, in his designs, European fashion, especially the UK. And in the end, he took what the UK had, made it so good, and kind of told people that it was American almost, and then sold it back to the UK. Because people seem to forget so easily, like what is right in front of them.
I think it's a great, it's a great philosophy, and a lot of what I talk about with people on this podcast so far is this kind of idea of Western culture's disenchantment with reality, like kind of wholesale. So we've become kind of, like you say, used to the things that are in front of us every day. The world has kind of been sort of had the magic taken out of it that maybe it used to have. And look, that's for a variety of reasons, and we can look at it through different lenses. You could look at it from like the beginning of the Enlightenment, when modern science came in. There was this kind of rational thinking that came in and took away the kind of soul of the world, is something Carl Jung would say, the de-souled world. But, I see it in all these different aspects of culture now. The way we kind of, I guess it's hedonic adaptation. You get used to your life and you kind of go around your life thinking it's mundane, thinking it's boring, that there's nothing to it. And you're sort of longing for, maybe it's like the magical object, the new thing that you need to consume, to buy, to purchase. Or it is, you're looking at another culture, like you say, in the UK, and you've mentioned with Australia, there is this very American-centric sort of outlook, and we tend to think their problems are our problems, and
Yeah.
and that's across a variety of different sort of, again, cultural spheres, from consumerism to like activism to all the culture war stuff as well, and a lot of it isn't. it's not relevant to us, but we have that. And maybe it's down to growing up on, you know, The Simpsons, or all that television culture that we kind of grew up with. But yeah, you're right. It's not relevant, and we do miss what is in front of us. And I think it's a great philosophy, like I say, because I think it reinforces that, and it's something I reinforce a lot on this podcast, is that in your day to day life, the story that you are living is like the greatest story you could ever live, because it is your story. And
Mm.
not to get too metaphysical about it, but there are probably events unfolding in your life that are absolutely ripe with meaning, that interconnect and could lead you to like some sort of destiny, or, you know, at least something new and exciting that is so personal to you that it is kind of re-enchanted. It is kind of magic. Um, yeah, so I think that's interesting. And what I like about the way you talk about your kind of relationship to building the brand in relationship to culture. You talk about, there's a quote from you. You say you want to utilize. No, I'll go with this one first. So you want the idea of wanting to be inspired by the past, but bringing it into the present to develop it for a better future. That's kind of what you've touched on there. You're taking.
Did I actually say that?
You did. It's very profound.
Wow.
So that's kind of what you mentioned. It's like this idea of taking the stuff that people have forgotten, kind of sleight of handing it and recreating it into something kind of that is valuing the past, acknowledging the present, and moving towards the future. And people are loving that, right? And then you also say we should utilize nostalgia and idealism to enrich your life and not restrict it. Can you expand on that a little bit for me?
So, in a similar way, we're talking about trying to be more grateful and the beauty in the mundane. I was having a great conversation about this last night, actually, with a good friend of mine. But um, I really hate when people. Um, I'll give you a perfect story about this. When I was younger, you know, teenagehood. It seems like a lot of my lessons I kind of learned around any time between, you know, 14 to 16 or 17. And I was telling my friend about this last night. It's kind of where I started to lose, in a good way, lose that kind of power that nostalgia had over me, and I think has over a lot of us. It's obviously a beautiful thing in a lot of other ways, but I always tell this story about when we were younger, and we're kind of hanging out in summer, and kind of long summer days when you're young, and some days are really fun with your mates, and some are just really boring. You kind of catch up, and then maybe conversations don't go anywhere. You didn't have anything planned, and it's just another hot day, and nothing's really going on. But you don't really remember it that way. You remember all the great memories, and you've kind of blocked out, those days where it was just hot, and maybe you were walking around all day, and then you sat down, and there was really nothing to do, but you don't remember it that way. Anyway, I recall so specifically, being 13 or 14, and maybe I was 14, and we're sitting down, and one of my friends goes, "Oh man, this summer sucks. Like, it's not like last summer. Last summer was the best." Blah blah. And I remember thinking, like, yeah, you know what, he was right. Like, I remember last summer was so fun. Like, I feel like we were doing much more interesting stuff. There was just better stuff on. Maybe there was more parties, or whatever it was that we cared about at that age. And then it got to the next year, and we were 15, and then he said the exact same thing, and he was like, "Oh man, this summer's not like last summer," you know, blah blah blah. And then it clicked to me. I was like, last summer we were complaining that it wasn't as good as the summer before, and it just kind of taught me this lesson of, like, things always kind of look a little bit prettier, more packaged in retrospect. And I think you can kind of take that lesson and apply it on like a cultural, historical scale. Like, people will look at, say the 90s were better, the 80s were better, the 70s were better. If you look at film and kind of the coming of age genre, I think about in when was Grease made? Let me check. Grease was made in what, the late 60s or the 70s, and um, in the 70s they're making movies about the 50s, and everyone's watching it and they're going, "Wow, I wish I got to grow up in the 50s." And in the 90s they're making movies about the 70s, and Dazed and Confused is a great example. And all the kids in the 90s are watching and going, "Wow, I wish I grew up in the 70s." And then what happened in like the 2010s or the 2020s, we started romanticizing 90s culture, and The Last Dance came out about Michael Jordan in the 90s, and we all say, "Wow, I wish I grew up in the 90s," and no one's actually ever living in the present. Um, so I guess to bring it back to your question is how how can we remove that? If I'm trying to problem solve the issue is like, okay, people obviously love aspects of the past and past eras. It might just be their like last summer, like we said, or it might be 10, 20 years before they were even born. I'm so in love with, there's been times where I've been in love with the 90s or in love with the 80s or 70s and 60s. Right now, I'm really in love with the 50s and 60s. And, um, you know, but do I really have the whole context? There was a lot of horrible things happening in the 50s and 60s. There was, a lot more sexism, a lot more racism. There was, you know, you know, uh, that's probably just like the top, and then there's like heaps of other things kind of below that iceberg. But you know, what I'm really trying to say is like when people say, "Oh, it's not like the good old days," they just mean like a few little, usually vanity aspects, like. Oh, I wish it was like the good old days. It kind of just means I wish I could wear a suit. So just say that. Just say, I wish I could wear a suit, and put a suit on and wear a suit, the style of suit that was from the 60s. And, people I think people don't understand what they're actually saying when they say, I wish it was like the good old days. I think, that's, people talk about like the things you can say now that you can't say now that you used to be able to say. And, to me, that's not really of interest, those conversations. But for me, a lot of the vanity aspect, it's like, oh, they wore these clothes in the 70s, or interior design was like this in the 70s or in the 60s or 50s. And um, the way I think about it is like, are you familiar with like the concept of metamodernism?
I'm not. Say more.
Yeah, it's so funny. I'm going to explain it horribly, but to kind of continue this long-winded point, um, it actually goes into a lot about what you were talking about, Jung, and what was the term you used? Modern science.
Like from starting from the Enlightenment, right? When those thinkers started
Yes,
thinking about what we think of as modern science.
yes. So basically, the story goes is like, there was cultural errors. We'll talk about it in the context of America, the culture era of modernism, where you know, there's kind of like the early, uh, like 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way up into the 60s. And this is when people believed in the government, they believed in their country, they loved their country, they believed in religion. When the country went to war, they agreed with what the country was doing. And then this all kind of started to fall apart, as you said, with modern science. And it's like, science kind of being in combat with religion, um, and also the Vietnam War and that being televised. Also, um, people coming back from the world wars and kind of their trauma, and people seeing that kind of started to make people think this idea, this modernism way of thinking culturally as a group, kind of fell apart. And that led into postmodernism, which was a distrust of government. People stopped believing in God and religion. People didn't trust the cops, and that kind of comes out in the films, and in the 70s, like 60s and 70s, like the birth of the anti-hero and rock and roll and the bad boy. And that ends up going into the 90s, which is like, Kurt Cobain and, you get into the Sopranos, where like a whole TV show where the characters don't grow and they just get worse and worse and worse, which is like they would never make that in the 60s because it's not of what the culture believes in. But you get to the 90s or the early 2000s and people are like, oh yeah, that's like me. Like I never grow. Like I just keep doing the same shit. Or like Seinfeld's like that. There's never really a happy ending with Seinfeld. Um, and then I explain all that because it's important to know that with metamodernism, it is kind of a combination of these two things. It's these modern values that have kind of existed for such a long time, and there's a reason why they were there, but some of them were fucked up. We found out not to always trust the government. We should be cynical and we should be sus and, keep an eye on them. Yes, spiritual health and having a relationship with something of some spiritual sense is important, but maybe the religions we're following or the structures of these religions aren't always the best. And I think me and my friends kind of spoke about that a lot for many years, and now it's kind of like somewhat baked into the way that we approach everything. This idea of like this complete earnestness and sincerity on one side, but there's very modern cynicism and the word deconstruction kind of gets used a lot in postmodernism. So it's like, we want to look at the 60s and have that nostalgic moment of like, wow, that's beautiful and I love that. But then go, wow, but there was also like so much fucked up shit about the 60s or 70s or whatever it is. And then you take the best parts and you kind of leave the bad stuff behind. I think that's how I would kind of explain or summarize that quote that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And that I try to do, not that I'm even like the best at doing that, but I guess that because I believe that comes out in the way that I will continue to like roll out the brand and the brand story and how that intertwines with my designs.
Yeah, you talk a lot about trying to integrate your story into every kind of drop you do, every kind of marketing sort of push. Like your story is very much integrated into that. And what you're saying there, it makes me think of another quote that you said. So I've just surprised you with all these quotes that I've prepped and I'm reeling off now. But you said the challenge I face is wanting, in effect, to show the grit and the mundanity of reality while also keeping it aspirational and looking deliberate, never looking like the shoot looks messy or grounded accidentally. And that seems to be kind of what you're talking about there again, this kind of, you're pulling from the past, this kind of sort of hazy Polaroid kind of aesthetic of, where images from that time, they feel like a memory. There's like an essence to them that is, because it's not hyper clear, it's not 4K like we have. That's one of my gripes with like 4K photos now. It's almost too clear. I think it literally is clearer than what the human eye can kind of see. So it feels there's like a jarring element to it. So you're talking about that. At least this is what I'm interpreting as the sort of grit of that aesthetic, with this kind of, presenting things sort of not just as like a, total grit and total kind of chaos. You're finding that balance, and that you're sort of balancing in a Jungian term would be the sort of tension of opposites. That was kind of Jung's whole spiel, was you needed to find that in culture, in yourself, and in lots of aspects. And it also made me think as well, you talk about how culture sort of moves and the kind of the response to certain eras. And that seems, again, if I take it down a Jungian route, because that is my kind of background, Jung always said that the unconscious was compensatory in the individual and in culture. So if the culture begins to do a certain thing and then things become too one-sided and too, maybe somewhat unhealthy, they're going too far one way, then the culture will respond through the unconscious, and that tends to first come out in the artists, in the in the people who are innovating, essentially. And I guess people who are potentially more tapped into the sort of depths of the collective psyche would be the artist, would be the sort of fashion, um, the people pioneering fashion, and that's coming through that into the culture to kind of rebalance that kind of heavy one-sidedness of whatever it may be in the time, right? Um, yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. The other thing I love about sort of pulling it back to that beauty in the mundane comment is, one thing I was reflecting on. I've recently sort of been trying to take a bit more of an effort when it comes to like fashion, and I sort of looking at it more, looking at the stuff I buy, trying to buy kind of like heritage brands that, older stuff that I know the quality is good. I know there's like a craftsmanship to it. I'm not just sort of going on kind of some fast fashion site and just buying something that I might wear 4 times and then never wear again because it fits all wrong. It feels all wrong. And ultimately, the process of it is questionable, right? And how we get that. What am I sacrificing for the sake of this cheap T-shirt, effectively? What people are having to do to make that. But yeah, the beauty in the mundane. It made me think of the. I'm going to get the quote here just so I don't butcher it. But William Blake, right, the poet. So he says, "To see the world in a grain of sand, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, eternity in an hour." Now, I'm probably going to get slated here just for trying to equate the works of William Blake to T-shirts. But look, this is your T-shirt. Your brand, Milkbar, have made this. It's a lovely T-shirt. It's crafted well. We're talking about your story, the things that matter to you when you make that. And we've also talked about how people are kind of disenchanted with their realities. They're kind of stuck in it. Like you said, they don't notice the sort of magic that is in front of them, and they're longing for a past that never was and trying to bring that into a future that never will be, because it's all this construct in their imagination that's emerging as a failure to appreciate what is there in front of them. And I think that relationship to fashion, but to everything you do, right? There's that quote, "How you do anything is how you do everything." And I think if you can start to appreciate, the things you wear, perhaps, let's just use that as the example, right, in the context of how we're talking. If you can appreciate the craftsmanship of how something was made, if you value the story behind a brand, if you resonate with the people who are telling that story with the brand, all of a sudden, something that's very two-dimensional, a T-shirt, effectively, becomes this three-dimensional portal into being re-enchanted with the world again, right? And I like to think if you can start doing that with different aspects of your life, you can maybe start to see, maybe you won't find your friends. So you won't, I'm not saying people are bored of their friends or their family, but people have these relationship issues in modern culture. And maybe it will mean that when you look at a person on the street you would normally ignore, instead you might see them like this portal, this less two-dimensional figure, but a kind of three-dimensional portal to something more. The fact that they're a human being like you with their own stories, their own struggles. And you do that in different aspects, the world becomes re-enchanted. Do you know what I'm saying? Am I talking nonsense here, Simon?
Yeah, I guess the way I would relate to that is just having gratitude for very simple things. One that people again will laugh at me at for admitting is, lately, I'm not perfect at it, but I almost like to be routined and thoughtful with everything that I do. And lately, my breakfast has been, literally a plum and a knife. And I explained to, and people are like, "Oh, are you like, what are you doing? Like, you trying to be more aesthetic because you're like eating with a knife? Are you trying to be more of a tough guy because you're eating with a knife?" Like, people take the piss out of me, and I love that. That's hilarious. But why the reason why I do it is like, first of all, I'm trying to eat something slow. I try to stay healthy, so I'm eating less. It's sweet, it's small, so it's like, um, I'm getting to have something sweet. The calories are actually low, and when I eat it with a knife, um, it lasts longer. So like I could eat a small plum in probably 5 bites and in less than 15 seconds. But when I eat it with a knife, it takes me about 5 minutes. And I'm instead of saying, breakfast is something I just have to do, and then the day starts, and then I do something. I can't wait to get through breakfast so that I can start my day. It's like, no, breakfast is a part of the day, even though I'm not having a massive one, and it's nothing um, fancy about it, but I have an experience. I think a lot of people feel that way about coffee. I feel, I have all this shit in this room. I have like an old phone. I have I got a typewriter, which I use from time to time. All these things are completely unnecessary, but I guess when you pay attention to those things, you kind of get to build an aesthetic language or a design language, and you get to kind of encompass yourself in a world of your own beliefs. If you allow yourself to actually journey into thinking about what you actually believe in, as opposed to um, following, group thought or cultural thought. You said something interesting about, culture moving and kind of the pendulum swinging, which I have a sort of feel for, and I'm sure through your studies you've been able to kind of get a feel for it as well. I I consider fashion to be the art of identity. Um, you know, it's not it's not the same as music. It's not the same as film, because at the end of the day, you can make a film about any idea if someone's going to fund it, of course. And you know, you can put this idea out there. It might be a very radical belief. Um, First of all, it's fiction, so it doesn't have to be something that stands in the real world. Um, you can make, a movie like The Joker, which is very dark, and it kind of explores things that, you know, just because you might like that movie doesn't mean you're going to go out and do the acts that are like committed in that movie. And same with music. How many people, I grew up listening to rap music because it was the thing in the culture at the time that I, grew up in. That was the pop music of my childhood. And that doesn't mean that I went out and did all the things that, the rappers were saying. Now, the difference with, and obviously all those things affect culture. So they affect culture and they affect the way people think when they consume it. But the thing about fashion is you you aren't really going to get most people to wear a radical idea. But when things are in trend, it's one thing to listen to a song in private and maybe feel that song. Let's say there's a certain sad song that you like, but you're maybe it's a guilty pleasure. Maybe you don't want to admit to other people that you've been sad at a certain time. At the end of the day, you can go home, consume that in your own privacy, and you can love it. It can be your favorite song at the moment. It can be your favorite song of all time. People would never know that about your personality if you don't admit it to them, if you don't share it with other people. Whereas fashion, it's the art of I'm gonna make this garment, and in some cases 100 people, in my case like 100, 200, 500, maybe 1,000 people are going to leave the house and utilize this item to represent themselves. And in some cases it's 100,000, like a Ralph Lauren will make a garment and there's 100,000s, maybe sometimes millions of this item out there, and individuals are being represented in the light of this Ralph Lauren garment. And, you know, it's almost, I'm not going to rank it as like the truest art form for where the culture is at, but it is quite interesting because, like I said, it becomes the art of identity. And when people are utilizing certain tools to go, yeah, I'm going to take that, that is me. And I am going to take that, that is me. And I think what you see as people get older is over time they've gone through certain trends. And once people get to a certain age, they've kind of decided like, oh yeah, I'm this. People, have gone through a bunch of trends. They took this, they took that, they took something else, and they go, this is me. I have been introduced through all these cultural beliefs, any beliefs, not even just cultural beliefs. And I've now decided that this is who I am. And it's kind of the truest form with that, with fashion, because, well, maybe not the truest form because, you know, I guess it just means that people want to be seen the way that they dress. It
Yeah,
doesn't,
I see what you mean. The people are kind of like they're taking a gamble of sorts, and they're sort of betting themselves into that gamble because you have to wear that out in public, right?
yeah.
Your identity is kind of in the bet to be like, okay, like I rate this,
You don't have that risk with music or film. You can hide it, you know?
yeah, interesting. I've never really thought about it like that, but all of a sudden I'm getting these flashbacks now of all the questionable fashion choices I made as a teenager, and being like, oh, there were some sketchy bets that I made at the time. To yeah, okay, interesting. All right, so I want to move it on. We sort of briefly touched on some Jungian ideas, but when I was doing my prep, doing my research, um, on you and on Milkbar, I stumbled across the fact that we had both been sort of influenced in our lives by a book that I spoke about on one of the podcasts, a couple of podcasts back, which was the book that I have right here, which is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, where it talks about, I will say actually, it's by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillet, who I didn't mention them on the last podcast, but it's, it talks about these kind of male archetypes of the king, of the warrior, the magician, and the lover, and how they kind of help make a sort of balanced man, sort of integrated, whole, maturated bloke, basically. And you talked in one of your blogs about your relationship to productivity and kind of building the brand and being a creative. You talked about the warrior, and it was this idea of, kind of embodying that archetype to work, to build what you were building, and the sort of toll it took on you and how it made you reflect on how you relate to kind of productivity. Can you kind of like expand on that, just tell that story a little bit of, your relationship
Yeah.
to kind of the grind, so to speak?
Yeah. So I'm not sure specifically what I said in that blog that you read, but it was probably, whatever I was feeling at
Do
the
you want
time that I wrote it.
do you want to know? Because I've got another
I would
quote.
love to actually. Yeah, I'd probably be able to give more perspective on it that way.
Okay, so the quote that I picked out, you were talking about how you're kind of dominated by this warrior archetype, kind of at various points in your life. But the quote was the idea of, you said, overworking myself rather than picking more sustainable and efficient options, just so I could feel like I was working hard to prove something to myself.
Yeah. So I think that was a weakness of mine for a long time. Um, people people that know the brand from early on will know that when I started, I sewed every garment myself, and I came in with a sort of athlete mentality. I have a background of playing sport and going to the gym and trying to get results in those things, and what the kind of age old thing with that, or like the Michael Jordan kind of way of thinking, which I've grown from, and maybe we can get into that later, is you know the next guy is working 2 hours, you work 4 hours. That is so much of a certain type of modern masculinity, and even traditional masculinity is like, I'm going to outwork this person, I'm going to have more grit, whatever that is. And that kind of transpired in almost finding the inefficient inefficient way to do things, because then I got to say that I worked harder. And it was, I guess it became a little bit of a control thing. It was like, you know, um, I can't always control if I'm successful, but I can control that I ticked off 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour. I set this list and I ticked it off. I can control that. And I'm sure a lot of people probably feel the same way when like maybe trying to up their productivity or getting really obsessive with a certain goal in mind, whether it be health and fitness or something entrepreneurial or other things in their life, almost like a get to obsessive like OCD point. Not that I'm like self-diagnosing that,
Mm.
but what I will say is, the warrior archetype exists in me, and I've had to kind of find a better relationship with that by really taking the emotion out of that conflict and just being like, is this efficient? Because when I was kind of going through this time, it was like exercise and work on the business. It was like, I was training for marathons. I was going to the gym, and I remember there was times where, I would just like wake up, sew 20 hours, sleep 3 hours, wake up, sew another 20 hours, like literally go eat lunch in the kitchen and like speed walk back to the sewing machine. And, what's funny is I've actually seen the most progress in my business in the past 5 months, with like, and I've probably, sounds so weird, but I've probably like worked the least hard.
No,
So
I don't think it sounds weird at all. I think I read your blog. By the way, a lot of the stuff I'm quoting here, it's on the Milkbar website. I urge everyone to go read the blog as well as check out the beautiful clothes, because you're really insightful in it. And it's something that I think we see dominate kind of social media culture, especially
yeah,
masculine social media culture. It's this kind of hustle culture, this idea of just need to, like you say, outwork everyone, get up at 5 a.m., stick your face in some ice water, do your journaling, meditate for 6. It's unfeasible realistically for a lot of people, especially people who maybe want to be more productive. They want to build better habits. They have a creative vision. If they're exposed to that, they're going to keep hitting this wall where they either can't attain that kind of goal, or like you found that you sort of were attaining that goal, and it was, in the end, it was counterproductive anyway.
yeah,
I've had a similar relationship, and I think I still do, with the same mentality you're talking about. I work full time, work in mental health, live here. I do this kind of when I can. I try and get the episodes out. I have to do my prep and things like that. And there's sort of various other things that I'm working on, academic studies and things like that. So it's a busy schedule. And I've always found very much sort of cracking the whip on myself to be like, yeah, this is it. This is how things are. This is how you're going to make something. How you're going to create. And I think, like you said, a lot of it does come down to, I'm sort of trying to, it's about me, isn't it? It's like, then I'll be worth something, maybe. Like deep down in there, it's probably, I have to do this. But it does become counterproductive because you can reach burnout. You can actually be less productive in your output as well, I think, like sort of you were saying. And
yep,
it could be this, this battle with wanting control. And one of the things it says in that book, which was really helpful for me, is it talks about the lover archetype. And it says the lover is kind of, all the other archetypes kind of can function independently, but they kind of need to operate with the lover working with them, because otherwise they become masochistic. And kind of what you're talking about, speed walking to the sewing machine and whatever it may be, like that sort of almost absurd productivity. On the surface, it looks very good, but you're kind of missing that kind of playfulness, that kind of less restrictive, kind of free aspect of yourself. I kind of call the lover archetype like holiday energy, and that might be a UK thing because it's rainy a lot here, but when UK people might relate, when you step off a plane and you feel that heat and the sun that you haven't seen for 300 days of the year, you get this thing about you, and all of a sudden you're like fun again. You're a bit like, here we go, like, and I think that playfulness is missing, and it's kind of like the core part of creativity ultimately, like the lover and the magician kind of interplay there. So yeah, I definitely think it's interesting, and I think it can, when you get in that state you talk about, when I've been in those states, and I still get in those states, and like I said, this is an ongoing kind of conversation and engagement with myself that I have. It can really affect like your interpersonal relationships. You can become so hyper focused on a goal, on an outcome, that you're in this kind of warrior mode all the time, and the lover aspect that sort of gets pushed away isn't showing itself when you're having these kind of interpersonal relationship kind of moments. So you become a bit cold and sort of narrow-minded to the world, right? Yeah, it's interesting. So you feel like you've got a handle on it now?
Ah, yeah, I wouldn't jinx myself like that, but I definitely think I'm handling it better. I think it helps when you see, everyone's biggest fear when they have a habit like that is that, there's always a reason why people do something, and you're always worried that if you stop performing the habit, that the bad thing that you're worried about is going to happen. And it's really helpful to being able to stop bad habits when you actually see results when you stop bad habits. And I have seen results. It took time, it was slow, but I was very stubborn on kind of maximizing efficiency as opposed to, um, just kind of trying to tick off as many hours as possible to say that I did a good job. Um, and yeah, I'm progressing and I'm getting better at it. I think every every weekend I get better at enjoying my weekend. And it's not always linear. It's not always like every weekend I get more relaxed or every weekend, shit happens. Like there's going to be weekends where I have to pack 100 orders and, you just do it. But, yeah, I definitely think I'm getting better at that. The other thing that I think was maybe easy for me to be able to kind of get in there and maneuver it and change it is that I, when I read that book and while I was reading, I was kind of telling everyone about this. I found that at different times in my life, I had been, um, for people that haven't read it, in the book, there's, like we said, the king, warrior, magician, lover. There's the good side and the bad side of all those archetypes. I actually realized while I was reading it, and I wasn't sure if it was maybe something that everyone felt, but when I asked people about it, it wasn't something that everyone felt. But I felt that I had been the good and bad version of every archetype in that book at some point in my life. And yeah, when I spoke to other people, they're like, "Oh no, to be honest, like I'm just this, or I just feel like one or two of these things." I just dropped my pen, and
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 then yeah, that
I
probably means they need to. I feel a bit bad saying it, but they might need to look a bit deeper, because the whole point of that is that we are always all those things. Whether it's
true.
consciously or unconsciously, we will fall into each polarization of that archetype. But yeah, go on, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, great analysis. And to be fair, the people that I was speaking to about it hadn't read the book, so I'm sure if they had, maybe they would see it that way. But I was just kind of summarizing the theory to them, and then they were reflecting on it. But yeah, with me, there were times where I'd been every version of every archetype, and that I'm interested to see how this made you feel. But when I realized that, it made me think like even more so than I had already felt, because I kind of already had this feeling. It's like, oh, I can be like whatever I want to, or I can kind of lean into any strength that I want to. People get caught up in telling themselves, oh, I am this, or my family, we're good at this. I come from a long line of people that are like this, and we do it this way. But I'm kind of just like, well, what do I want? What's going to make me effective or happy, or how can I contribute? And then, lean into certain aspects of the different archetypes that were kind of made obvious to me in that book.
Yeah, Yeah, 100%. And I think it's a really good book in the way that it will explain kind of what those archetypes look like, and it not only gives you a kind of good map to kind of model yourself on those. Because the great things about archetypes is they exist in our psyche, but the reason we resonate with certain media like films and stuff is because we're seeing those archetypes and we know them because they're like older, they're as old as time. So when we see, you know, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, we're not going, oh yeah, like I really resonate with this, and I want to dedicate my entire life to it because there's a laser sword and a guy in a black suit with a deep voice, who's his dad. Spoiler. But it's the archetypal journey of a hero, right? And from a Jungian sense, like Jung thought these were cross cultural. So we had these patterns of like warriors and other, there were lots of other archetypes, warriors, heroes, things like that. But they existed through the cultures, regardless of transmigration. So similar kind of symbols, similar images from different cultures across the globe that had never met. So he said, well, they must be coming from somewhere. So this is where he started to talk about the collective unconscious, that we kind of share this sort of space in our psyche that is deep in there, that has this stuff in there. So, and I think not just from a sort of academic read a book abstract sense of like, oh, this is what the warrior archetype is, I'm going to now try and emulate that. What Jung would say is like that psychic energy exists within you. It's there,
Yeah.
and you can either do something with it or you cannot. But the problem you have is if you don't, and it wants to come through you, there are consequences, and that might lead to like sort of neurosis, sort of other stuff, and ultimately possibly death. Because if you're not bringing forth what is within you, then there could be sort of dire consequences to that. People have these like potentials, these lives they could live, and if they don't live them, they often feel a certain way, and that can lead to certain other bad habits. That's a story for another day, obviously. But yeah, I think that's what Jung would say. Is it isn't just a case of reading. You read it and you go, "Oh, I can emulate that. I know what that archetype is." It literally wants to come out of you, and I think when you can align with it, you're kind of riding a wave. You're surfing this wave that wants to move, and that can ultimately lead to, great work, great engagement with life, real engagement with life, because you're giving the gods their due, so to speak. He often referred to the archetypes as like gods because they controlled us, they controlled our behavior, and he said men have mythical fates as much as the Greek heroes do, and we would suffer a tragic fate if we did not acknowledge the things that were unconscious normally within us and were beckoning to get out. So yeah, it's but what I love about it with your story as well is it's interesting to hear how these ideas manifest in different elements of like creativity and sort of engagement with life. A few podcasts back, I had Kofi King on, who's a bare knuckle boxer. He's not too familiar with some of these ideas, but I sent him some stuff prior, and we talked about it on the episode. And to hear him just be like, "Oh, this is what kind of how I relate to what I do as a bare knuckle boxer and whatever else it may be in my life," all of a sudden, what he's saying is what is being talked about in this book. So
Yeah.
it's like
Wow.
it's a real thing, it's happening all the time. So
One thing I wanted to add, just
away.
before we get on to the next thing, was, you know, yeah, I feel so seen when you say that stuff, and I obviously read that in the book, but you've summarized it really well, and it reminded me of it. I feel like I read people really well, and I can really pick up when people are being fake, and it's not always a negative thing. I think some people just small talk and they want to move on with their day, sometimes maybe they feel like you're not interested, so they kind of just want to like talk about the weather and move on. So, but I really dislike small talk, and I really dislike when people are fake or when I feel they're being inauthentic. So I'll actually, I'm always trying to like get to something real or authentic. And that doesn't mean we have to have like a deep conversation about like, very personal things or anything like that. I think I'm always searching for authenticity in conversation. And I felt what you just said because it, the feeling I have is almost what you're saying. It's like, oh no, you're lying that you're feeling these things. And not to say that I know exactly how everyone is feeling, but I kind of, you know, in a similar way, I'm like, no, this is a part of all of us, and we all are nothing and everything, which is kind of, I guess, what Jung is trying to say. And it almost irritates me when people don't understand that about themselves. Obviously, everyone's on their own journey with it, but yeah, that made me feel seen when you said that, because I can struggle sometimes with when other people don't understand that and they're not authentically communicating that. But obviously, I say that hyperbolically, like I do have patience with it, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I once had a conversation with a Jungian analyst, and uh, his surname has slipped my brain, so I'm not gonna say his name just because can't. I don't know. I can't remember the full name. So, but he
Yeah.
once said to me, I was sort of chatting to him. It was before I actually sort of went and studied Jung, um, and we were talking about how some people will look at Jung's sort of ideas and they will kind of see Jung as a bit of a sort of crackpot, effectively, and like because of the way modern psychology has gone, it's gone very much away from the symbolic, from kind of dream analysis and what Jung was talking about. And I remember mentioning the archetypes and being like, yeah, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, well the archetypes, yeah, we can't really, that's not really a thing. I don't really believe in that. And this analyst said to me, he was like, yeah, well, people can say that all they want. They can not believe in it. It doesn't mean it's not affecting them. Do you know what I mean? Like every single day. And like we've
Yeah.
talked about in this episode, it's like you see it in the culture. You see the sway of the culture and how things start to manifest. And you see these archetypes appear in the culture. You see it in yourself. It's there all the time. And I think that's kind of the another way I think of like re-enchanting the world. We think we live in a godless world, but if you acknowledge that these psychic energies that are the archetypes are moving through us all and through our, through us individually and through our culture, what better representation of like gods is there? These things that we cannot control. It's like when someone loses their temper, they're kind of possessed by an archetype, right? It's like kind of,
Mm.
I guess, Mars or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so yeah, I do think there's a lot of fruit to it. I'm glad you feel seen. That's nice. That's good. Okay, so I just want to move on then. So we were discussing before the pod how we pronounce it. Pronunciate. So Miyamoto Musashi.
Musashi, yeah.
Musashi, yeah, Miyamoto Musashi. So you talk about is it like it was a fiction book? I've never read it, so you're gonna have to just tell us a little bit about it. But I want to just talk
Yeah,
about how
so
that influenced you.
I growing up, I read a lot of comic books when I was real young, like primary school. But I never got into manga, which is, you know, Japanese comics, basically. And I was reading this book, The Book of Five Swords, which is, kind of become repopularized recently. But I'm pretty sure, Miyamoto Musashi, he was this, if I can summarize it now, it's been a year or two since I've read it. Um, he was a 16th century samurai. And for people that don't know, at that time in Japan, people were samurais, and that basically meant that they would train in sword fighting, and then they would just like pull up on another samurai and be like, "We're fighting to the death." And Miyamoto Musashi won 60-0, obviously, because there was no, if you lost, you died. So it was kind of like you're either undefeated or you're dead. So he was 60-0, and then he retired. and he got into calligraphy, growing gardens, and then writing, which is like where this book comes from. And he kind of goes into, the kind of lessons that he learned through his life, and being like very, so violent, and such a example of the warrior archetype, and then gardening, and then calligraphy, and then, becoming a thinking man, and philosophical, and writing. And um, so, yeah, to summarize, Vagabond is a fictional retelling of his life, and it kind of goes through the youth of this Miyamoto Musashi character, and him kind of learning to be a sword fighter, and basically his goal in this fictional retelling is he wants to become invincible. He wants to kill so many men that he feels invincible. And I guess that's a kind of symbolic thing for probably what a lot of people feel in certain different pursuits. You mentioned before that, me trying to work so hard, you want to feel invincible, you want to feel some sense of power or some sense of worth or whatever it is. Anyway, the reason why I related and connected so much to his story and some of his writing, and some of the fictional retelling, was that I've always been quite obsessed, and I guess I just relate to certain individuals or characters that kind of show a spectrum of masculinity. It's interesting in the fashion world because there are men that will dress a little bit more freer, and that will be impressive to the fashion community, because it's like, well, you've done something really brave, because men are meant to dress like this, and you've gone over here and you've dressed like this, and that is brave, and I think that is impressive. But what I think has always made me unique in my field is that I am not so much interested in doing the most other side of the spectrum thing, as a way of expressing myself in fashion or creativity or even in my beliefs. I am very balanced. I kind of grew up in the middle of two worlds. So where I grew up is, when my family moved to Melbourne, Australia from Italy, they were in the north of Melbourne, and the north of Melbourne, where all the immigrants came at that time, was very, you know, as you can imagine, any immigrant suburbs in any country ever at any era. It was like that. And then over the years, it's become gentrified, and it's kind of like the trendy spot to be now. And we're still in a kind of similar area to where they migrated. And so I kind of exist and grew up in with influences of that area. But being immigrants, my family also has a lot of traditional values, and I also grew up with a lot of people, living in adjacent suburbs that are way less trendy and gentrified or whatever. And that always kind of like put me in the middle of like two very opposing cultural beliefs, meaning, on one hand, I'm an athlete and I play footy, Australian footy, which to compare it is like, maybe the way that a rugby is seen in the UK. It's kind of like the hyper masculine sport in our culture, So on one hand, I'm playing footy, and on the other hand, I'm op shopping and interested in film and art and whatever. And I think there is actually plenty of examples of men going, "Oh, I'm going to reject kind of the status quo of masculinity. I'm going to go over here and do what I'm interested in." And I still think that's brave, even though there is a lot of examples of it. But I've actually found it kind of strangely hard to come by when someone's like very traditionally masculine, but also has a bit of both. It's weird. It's weird that I guess it's true in most things. It's almost harder to balance it than just go to either side of the spectrum. So when I heard about Miyamoto Musashi, and I'm like, this guy is, um, you know, incredibly disciplined in like an act of violence, but also a gardener, and so eloquent with his word and his thinking, and calligraphy, which is like, basically like painting of the time. Um, I guess another thing that made me feel seen, and there was also just like things in that book that kind of challenged where I was at the time. I remember this quote of, what was his whole thing was, so when he retired from sword fighting, he started his own school, teaching other people how to sword fight, and his school was called the School of Two Swords, and his whole thing was like, you have two hands, why are we fighting with one sword? Like, we should all learn to fight with two swords. Um, and he kind of details in the book. He's like, if you have, because all these samurais, they would walk around with, I think, a long sword and a short sword, and they would kind of wield one sword. And his point was like, why would you risk death without pulling all your weapons out of your tool belt? Because people were, dying in battle, and they still hadn't used their other weapon. So he came up with this whole other style of sword fighting, where he was like, no, you are going to use every tool you have on the battlefield to win. And that made me think about, we all have kind of those things where you're like, oh, but if I did this, like, I guess with artistic integrity, there is a lot of like, oh, I'm doing this because I feel this way. But if I was playing by the same rules as the people that have succeeded more than me, I would be doing amazing, and my career would be successful. And I didn't. That quote kind of brought up a bit of that. It was like, all right, so if it's like me going into battle with, one sword when I have two, or one hand behind my back, getting into a fight and being like, oh, I lost the fight, but if I had both hands, I would have fucked you up. And it's kind of like, that doesn't mean anything. So get your two hands out and see what you got. And that actually transpired in me making my most successful collection ever. Because I kind of was like, I'm going to make what I like, but I'm also going to meet the culture and my audience halfway. And the success that came from that was ridiculous, and it was actually because of that quote. So I was kind of weighing up, like, a bit of commerce and a bit of business, but also like, okay, what do I like and what do I want to bring to the table? And that paid off, and it all stems from a Musashi quote.
Interesting, yeah. And it seems like that idea of kind of the integrated warrior. They would probably say in that book that a good warrior is both deadly on the battlefield, but also quite a handy gardener, right? You should be able to, wield your strength, but also reflect on your weaknesses and maybe the things that you are not looking at, And I think, again, that sort of tension of opposites there and what you're doing creatively. Yeah, I think it's interesting because you're acknowledging that, and this is kind of your message that you've talked about, like, culture is doing a thing for a reason. It's not like, we look at trends and there's a tendency for people to maybe say, oh, well, that's just sort of trendy and I won't go anywhere near that. But like the whole of culture, or like a large sway of culture, can't be wrong. There's obviously
Kind of live storytelling, isn't it? It's live mass storytelling, cultural trend. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, it's like humanity telling a story about itself at a certain geographical place, at a certain place in time, and you can completely write that off and be like, oh no, but I like this, and there is value to that. I think you should do like Rick Rubin sort of says about creativity, do what you like and the rest will follow. And I think that's true. But you don't create in a vacuum, do you? You sort of like, you create in the culture, whether you think you're being influenced by it or not, or whether you think you're completely separate away from what's happening. I don't think you ever truly can be. I think, phenomenologically, the way we interpret reality, we're bound up by like people and place. This is kind of the theme of what we've been talking about. We are those things as much as those things kind of are us. So you can't just make your thing be creative outside of that. And I think that's sometimes it can be difficult to acknowledge that and to kind of not die on a hill, with your hand behind your back, to be like,
Yep.
yeah, but I have integrity. And it's like, yeah, well, good for you, but no one's ever going to see your work or engage with your work. And with a slight adjustment, it's not even like a compromise in values. It could just be that you just need to reflect on your values and, like you said, what is important to you. Do it with this show all the time. Like, we put out on our social media, we put out podcast clips, but we also put out other content, which is sort of quotes that are kind of spoken with video, right? And when we started doing it, I sat down with my editor, and we didn't sort of strategize. I talked about values. I was like, here's how I want to do this. Here's the values that we kind of hold. We try and stick to these values. If we come to a impasse where we feel maybe something will be improved if we adjusted our values slightly, we'll discuss it in the moment. I'll give you an example. It's like with those videos, with the voiceovers, we could use AI, right? We could use an AI voiceover. We have that capability, but I didn't want to. So I will reach out to voiceover artists and I will pay them. I could save my money. I could just get an AI to read it. It would probably be passable. Many people wouldn't notice, but you have these values and you say, okay, well, this is what I'll stick with. But there will be moments where you kind of have to question that to improve, to move forward. And I think that's a really good thing to acknowledge creatively, because I think a lot of people they romanticize the idea of being creative, where it's me against the world and I will not budge. And I think, acknowledging that balance is really cool. So on the aspect of Miyamoto, you were talking about cultivate and harvest. And there's a quote from you as well, which I really, really, really like. You said, to be vulnerable to the reality of nature and work with it, to plant a seed in the hopes it'll feed a village in months, to be at the mercy of the weather and the risks that brings your crops. The patience of a farmer has stuck with me.
Wow. Yeah. So we were speaking before this interview, and you mentioned that blog that I'd written, and hearing you read it again, I feel like I actually almost understand it now in reflection more than when I wrote it, just from hearing you repeat it then. But so I think what I was kind of touching on was being vulnerable to nature, planting a seed that could grow in months. What am I touching on there? We spoke about earlier that I loved ticking off lists. I loved saying I worked 10 hours, not more, and this person worked 8 hours, just to myself. I wasn't going around saying that. And I loved that because like I said, I had control over it. But being vulnerable to nature is like, I'm going to accept that I don't have control over this thing, and I'm going to let go of the idea of I'm going to work 12 hours because that means I won. If my goal is to work hard, then I am going to work more hours than everyone else, and then I've won. But being vulnerable to the idea of trying to be efficient and trying to get results, that's probably interesting to dig into. Like, I almost had like a bit of a Buddhist mindset of like the act of doing the thing is the win. And I actually took it to a toxic place, which I'm not sure many people talk about, because it's like I fell in love with the process too much that I actually wasn't getting any results, and that was becoming a bad thing. So I guess actually being vulnerable to the idea of no, like I am going to let these results define me, and I am going to make adjustments off the results is a
So was
very
that
scary thing.
was that just like sort of not putting stuff out there? Was that just taking too long in the kind of the ideas phase? How did that manifest? Just expand slightly briefly.
Yeah, so to be specific on it, it was something like, for example, if I'm sewing, um, I don't have time to design ahead, or if I can't do the right things for my business, I can't afford to make a jacket, you know, because I've wanted to make jackets for years, but I haven't been able to, because I just haven't done the correct business things or the smart business things, the things that I told myself I have too much integrity to do. It then meant I couldn't make the jacket that I'd been dreaming of making for 5 years. Um, as a real concrete example, like, and you don't progress because of that. So it's like that's the funny thing. Like people have this really weird, mystic idea and relationship with creativity, but if you don't learn to build in the commerce aspects of it, you're actually never going to be able to make what you truly want to make.
Mm.
Especially in film, like, something like film and fashion, where there is like cost value to making these things, and you need certain people with certain talents. It's not like painting. You can't just like kind of get some spare change, get every color of paint in the rainbow and sit down and work it out. It's like, no, it costs things to make what you want. Like if you want to have no rules and make exactly what you want, unless you like have worked your ass off in another career and become rich, like you're not going to be able to make that movie that you want to make. Like you're not gonna be able to make the jacket you want to make unless you're ready to drop a couple grand. I promise. Like, um, so yeah, there's really no way you come to learn. There's no way around just like kind of bringing those two worlds together.
Yeah, yeah. First thing I kind of thought there is that Rick Rubin quote. He says, "You're a success as soon as you put something out into the world," and I think there is that element of like you could spend forever thinking about doing the thing, but like you've kind of touched on, there's a lot that you can find out about yourself from doing the thing. So like you as a person, by the sounds of it, from what you've said, have changed quite significantly over the sort of journey that you've had with Milkbar and making clothes and marketing clothes and engaging with people. So you sort of change in the process of doing. So there's an argument to not procrastinate about actually creating something. But then also there's this element that seems really important of like compromise. Like if you want to release stuff into the world, you have to take into account the context in which you're creating in. If you want it to be seen, if you want to do these things, there is an element of a working with reality as opposed to working sort of in a vacuum, like we said. And I guess that sort of, what you're talking about there, to be vulnerable to the reality of nature and work with it, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? You are talking about it from from many different angles, I guess, from this kind of like the sort of process of maybe literally planting seeds or whatever it may be, but also working with the culture to acknowledging that, like, going back to what you said earlier about culture shifting, like it's all seasonal. We live in eras, and you have to kind of acknowledge it to be able to put stuff out in it. Otherwise, yeah, you do end up limiting yourself and cutting yourself off. Okay,
To
cool.
go just before we go on to the next thing, to go into like your whole point about the Jungian archetypes is the analogy there is that in the Vagabond story, the fictional retelling of Musashi, when he decides to stop fighting, he ends up in this village, and there's famine in the village, and he puts the sword down. He doesn't want to fight anymore, and he has to feed this village. He has to grow crops for this village that I'm pretty sure like all the farmers in the village had died. So he had to learn how to grow the crops, and him being the best fighter in the land meant nothing. It's like, all right, are you going to feed these hungry people or not? And he like I wrote, will I'm going to plant this seed, and it may or may not feed the whole village in a few months. And every other skill that I've acquired to this point does not matter. So it is a little bit of a leap of faith thing, which people kind of get to at different points in their life. You kind of just got to go like, fuck it, I believe in this. I got to try it. And it symbolizes the how would you put it? It symbolizes the letting go of the warrior archetype. It symbolizes like, I'm going to put down my sword and accept that having control of this situation, in his case, sword fighting, in my case, overworking. And, I think, again, to your point, when I wrote that, I didn't even realize what I meant, but that's what I meant. And that's what happened after I wrote that. So,
Yeah,
more to your studies. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's it is. I support that message for kind of people in their lives. I think there's a lot of anxiety, from working in mental health as well. There's a lot of anxiety, people desperate to control what's happening around them, and you need to have this element of like, there are many things that you cannot control. That may be in like a creative venture, but it may just be in like when you go out the front door, right? There's going to be stuff that's going to happen that you cannot predict. And that, in a sense, should be part of like the mystery of life. That's the process of life. And I think, yes, embracing that, acknowledging that, yeah, there is a time to sharpen your sword, to hone your skills, and to bend elements of the world to your will, in certain areas is totally beneficial. But there are so many aspects that we cannot control. And instead of trying to spend our whole lives trying to control them, to acknowledge that that's just how it's supposed to be, and that in itself is like is a skill to be cultivated, and allowed to flourish within you. I think is a really, really good message. So,
And can I add
okay,
again? I'll interrupt again. It's funny when you hear about you said that a key thing that kind of sparked my ears was bending, like, what did you say? Like bending the world to like how you want it to be,
yeah,
as an example. You hear that a lot about Steve Jobs. Like they say he had this thing called the reality distortion field, where like he would tell his workers like they're going to do a certain thing and that had never been done before and it was impossible. And when he was in the room, it seemed possible. And he was always going against these things that were natural. He like, if you think about an iPhone, like this thing is like, we came from like dirt and wood, and we have this thing that is like alien now. Like I'm talking to you on a Mac, and it is like it's a beautiful product, and it comes in a perfect box. Like these things aren't natural. And but what you also hear about Steve Jobs, a person that always bended reality, was he was also always emotional. Like he would get angry. He was crying constantly. And this is my main gripe with Michael Jordan is like he would bend reality to his whim, and he had so much power and he had so much control, but he couldn't even control his own emotions. He's like so spiteful. He's so passionate and passion's a good thing and a bad thing. You're going to get the whole spectrum of kind of having to deal with that. And you know, it's not the most important thing always, but I do value my peace. And I think people that are always trying to bend the world to their whim don't seem to have that.
yeah, 100%. And I guess you got to ask yourself, at what cost, right? At what cost do you want to be great? And especially with someone like Michael Jordan, I guess, like Steve Jobs, like these people that are kind of these outliers. It's like, yeah, they were absolute magicians, but yeah, like you say, at what cost? At what cost to your peace? And yeah, then you got to weigh that up. What's more important ultimately? So
And I also think you don't have to do it that way. I also think you can be great and not do it that way, which is like something I really strongly believe in.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think you've touched on it as well, that you found that when you have found that balance, you've actually found things to be more productive. And I think I've seen that in my own life as well. And it's a different kind of I guess it's a bit like the Tao, isn't it? It's kind of like that sort of Chinese philosophy. The Tao is supposed to be the middle way, is that balance between like chaos and order. And it isn't, I think maybe what a lot of people think with that kind of philosophy is that it's you just let life happen to you. And it isn't. It is intentional. You know, the Tao is like intentional stuff. And look, I'm not that clued up on the Tao Te Ching, but as far as I believe, it's like an intentional kind of letting go. It's like you are focused, you are paying attention to what is going on in your life, but you are also allowing it to unfold and acknowledging that you're part of that process. And I think that's massively key. And your story seems to be a testament to that. And I think it's it's good to hear, because I think it should encourage people to be creative, but in, like we talked about, in this world of like hustle culture and waking up at 4 a.m. and doing all these things, it's like, who's it for? Like, is it helping? Is it actually helping you? Or are you spending so much time doing all this pre-build up, to being creative or being productive, that you never actually end up being creative or productive because you spent 6 hours your day? Would it be, maybe you're the type of person that needs to wake up like miserable as hell, smoke a cigarette, have a coffee, take a deep breath, and then just like, yeah, then go to work, but in like a kind of more open, playful way. And maybe you can make great things from that. You don't necessarily need to sort of have everything so regimented, because I think when you do, as we've touched on, you take nature, and when I say nature, I'm sort of referring to reality, right?
Yeah.
To the unfolding of events around you. I think you take it out of the equation. A lot of these guys that post these kind of morning routines, if you actually think about them doing that every day, it seems like such a lonely existence. It's like, oh,
It is lonely.
you've sort of spent this whole time, and like I said, I've lived that. I do live it at times. You do too, and I know firsthand, even my routine isn't to the extreme that some of these kind of manosphere productivity gurus are kind of putting out there. But it can, yeah, you can kind of, like I said earlier, neglect your interpersonal relationships with people. You can become a bit sort of dead into the world, in the sense of, you maybe stop being as fun, because you're like, this has got to be done, this has got to be done. Yeah, and I think it is important to acknowledge nature, to acknowledge reality, to acknowledge that some of the best art, some of the best creative works, be it from fashion to basketball to the latest new smartphone, could come out of a reciprocal communication with reality, not a forcing reality to do what you will. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been there, I felt it, and yeah, I had to learn that lesson myself as well.
Good. Good. I'm glad I'm not I'm not alone in this
Yeah.
peculiar type of suffering. So okay, so we're going to wrap up soon, but I just want to ask you one more question. I just want you to elaborate. Tell me about Noni, and
Mm,
more
yeah.
specifically, this idea of creating a legacy and a visual language that speaks to a story.
Yeah. So, yeah, the beautiful thing is, and what you're referring to is, nonni is like, grandmother in Italian is nonna, and grandfather is nonno, and, nonni is kind of the way you refer to the both of them. Um, you know, I we spoke about before about how Australia kind of, in some ways, lacks a cultural history that some other countries have already, just due to like being around longer. For example, it means that we lack everything across the board. It means we we lack customs. It means that we lack uh, obviously traditions and design language and all the kind of knickknacks that come along with a healthy, strong culture. Um, when I talk about building a legacy, I'm probably referring to two things. One thing is uh, some people might be born in Australia, be interested in design, or be interested in something cultural or um, creative, and just be like, oh, I'm going to move to America. I'm going to take my talents there. I'm going to move to Europe or whatever. And I kind of look at it as an opportunity. I look at it as, the slate's kind of clean and we kind of get to write our own story here. But like we spoke about before, you kind of look around every day and there are things to be inspired by that no one is noticing yet. Um, so I did a video on this recently. My brown colorway, the t-shirt that you're wearing at the moment, it's called Wog Brick Brown. Wog is kind of the slur that was used for European migrants that came to Australia, and it then eventually became like a term of endearment that we use amongst ourselves. And the brick houses were kind of, when they were made, they weren't sexy, and a lot of people still don't think they're sexy. They don't think they're cool or whatever. But these kind of orange or brown brick houses were made because they were cheap and because immigrants were poor. And now I think they're really beautiful as like a second generation Italian in Australia. I kind of look at that history and I go, there's, brutalism, it kind of tells a story about the architects that designed that style of architecture and how it's a sign of the times and a reaction to the wars and a reaction to modernity, or modernism. Um, so when I talk about building a design language, it's kind of bringing the attention to these things that are not being repackaged and shown to people. I think, for example, there's an Italian American language. People didn't realize until Sopranos came out, but there's a language. Before that, there was like obviously The Godfather and Goodfellas and stuff like that. And then then the Sopranos was like a Y2K version of that. It's like, how has that evolved into a more modern way? But I think that doesn't define us here. And even on a bigger sense, like, what is Australia? Like, Australia, that kind of comes into my name, Milkbar. Um, for people that don't know, in other countries, milk bars are like our bodegas, in America. What would the UK equivalent be of like a bodega?
Corner shop.
Corner shop, yeah. So Milk Bar is kind of our corner shop, but they don't really exist anymore. As I'm sure like a lot of bodegas or corner stores don't exist in other places because there are bigger businesses that have supermarkets and they've kind of obviously become more successful as time has gone on. But the meaning I've kind of found in the name as it's gone on is, a milk bar is kind of, one of our little things that we say, oh, this is Australian. This is our thing. We made this. Like, we have milk bars and other countries don't. And the funny thing is the thing that's being called Australian was actually always owned by migrants, whether it be Asian families or Lebanese families or Greek or Italian families, always owned milk bars. And, when new cultures move to Australia, they're the ones owning those kind of businesses. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to represent Australia. It's like the thing that is representing us is actually saying that we're multicultural. And I love that my name kind of has a bit of a double entendre on that. Outside of that, the thing I probably spoke about in that blog about leaving a legacy is, I think about the men in my family and, both of my grandfathers on both sides came from Italy and worked here to pay to like bring the rest of their siblings here. So they came here, got a job, started working, paid for each sibling one by one to come over here. And then you have, the work that my dad did, like for a lot of people in his generation, um, depending on what culture you come from as a first gen, it's like either expected or not expected to go to university and be successful or be extra educated. But he put in the extra effort to do that, and I think about that lineage of discipline and that lineage of hard work and kind of where that takes you compounding wise over generations. And I'm really interested in that, and I'm really interested in kind of having my own journey with that. And yeah, it's definitely transpired in having this business and doing something unique with that.
Yeah, and so what I'll say is what I think, and I have touched on it in this, but I do think it is so fantastic that, you know, you bring so much of your story and the sort of culture in Australia's story into what you're creating a Milkbar, right? And what I think you're doing is you're showing that like there's more symbolic nature to life, right? Because the symbol is kind of like an image that contains more than what it is in its like, you know, presentation. In effect, that's like a, you know, rough kind of explanation of it. But that time and effort that you're spending, and the fact that it matters to you to be intentional. You know, we talked about you with the was it a plum? What was it? It was a
Cutting a plum for
cutting a
breakfast.
plum. Yeah, but like that in itself is like intentional, right? It's a focus act. That's been a theme of kind of what we've been talking about in a lot of your actions. And I think that choice to be intentional with bringing your story into things, the reasoning behind everything, it's a doorway into, like we said at the start, I think re-enchanting the world for people if they do that in their own lives, right? It's not just like, you know, making choices unconsciously, trying to ask yourself, why am I making that choice? You know, what are my values? What is important to me? What has shaped me? What has shaped me geographically? What has shaped me kind of interpersonally? And then bringing that into the things you do, especially into creative work. So I think that's where the best creative work comes from. It's like bringing that forth. You have a story to tell, and I hammer that point home again. It's like we are all living in the greatest story that could be told for ourselves. You know, it's because it's so personal, yet it is by its very nature. It's archetypal. We we're all Luke Skywalker, effectively, right? You've got your own personal details that kind of dress the broader archetypal elements of your life, right? That's kind of what the idea of a personal myth is, in a sense. And I think you really, not only do you acknowledge that in, you know, in your blogs and in the way you talk about what you do in your life, but you bring it forth in your, you know, in your brand, in your clothes. And I think that is fantastic. I urge everyone to go and check out Milkbar. Where can people find you? Where can people find the brands? What else do you want to share in terms of social media platforms? Tell
Yeah.
us.
My website is milkbarmelbourne.com, and Chris has done a lot of great research and read up on some of the old blogs that I've written on there if you're interested. And you'd probably put a battery in my back to start writing the blogs again. Try doing once a week or something.
Please do.
But yeah, it's nice. It's nice when people like yourself get the chance to read them and kind of reflect on it deeply. And I've had some beautiful like emails on a Monday morning of people that have woken up, had their coffee, and had a read and kind of reflected on it and sent back their thoughts. And that's almost better than selling 100 t-shirts. So if that's probably where I'm sure a lot of your listeners are inclined to have a good read and have a reflection. So if they're interested in that, do that on the website. But also my Instagram is just Milkbar. I got pretty lucky. I hustled that Instagram name. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5, 6 letters.
That is
or like,
pretty astronomical that you managed to nab that. That's the story
yeah,
for.
7 letters.
Okay, that's wild. Yeah, that you managed to
Yeah,
get that at this time in this
la,
economy.
la, yeah, I got a good deal. Um, and yeah, last thing I'll add is just, yeah, what a great chat. Thank you for having me. I think you're doing great work, and it's beautiful that you're bringing like a philosophical, and you've obviously studied Jung very well and very in depth. And yeah, I feel like I'm doing a therapy session right now in a great way, not in an invasive way. It's beautiful to talk about storytelling and archetypes, and I guess that is probably one of the ways in which you and I probably live a spiritual life, is seeing the connections in all of us through archetypes. And I'm very grateful for this chat. It's allowed me to reflect a lot.
Well, thank you, man. Honestly, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And yeah, look, the way I see it is, I think with these ideas, people can study these things in books and they can sort of read about it from like an academic approach. But I take the mindset of the best information you're going to get is from people living life, um, and who just sort of live out these ideas and represent it in a variety of different ways. And I think that sort of reinforces that idea of how these things are important, because you see it in so many different avenues, so many different journeys, so many different stories. And all I want to do really is encourage people to look at their own lives and to reflect on themselves, to reflect on their potential, to see maybe the stories they are living within, to see what is important to them. Yeah, and look, I think your story is fantastic, and I think it's a there's so many great insights that you've shared today. So I'm really thankful for that. We haven't talked a lot necessarily about the clothes, but generally, as I said earlier, the stuff you make is brilliant. I love the cut of the stuff. I just got the singlet came through along with this, and the singlet is there you go. It's
Yeah,
absolutely you know top notch. It's what's the Italian? Is it bellissimo? Is that I don't know. I'm probably being
you got it.
I got it. Okay, thank God.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a gamble. But yeah, look, it's absolutely fantastic stuff. But yeah, look, I can't thank you enough. Your insights, fantastic. I urge everyone to check it out. Yeah, and I look forward to seeing what's coming. So thank you, man.
And so with you, thank you for allowing me to share my story. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.